There's a moment when the silence becomes unbearable, not because no one is speaking, but because no one is truly seeing you. Everyone knows what it's like to feel invisible in a world full of noise. But stay, because Nietzsche believed that when you're losing everyone, you might be finding yourself. At first, you don't even notice it. The transformation isn't loud. It's slow, like fog creeping into the corners of a familiar room. You start speaking less, but not because you don't have anything to say. You just begin to realize most people are only listening to respond, not to understand. So you stop filling the silence, and in doing so, you start to hear something else, something deeper, just beneath your own surface. You stop laughing at the jokes that feel like weapons wrapped in politeness. You stop explaining your boundaries to people who had no intention of honoring them. You stop softening your truth for people who mistake your clarity for cruelty. And this begins the vanishing. Not of you, but of the identity you wore, like armor. You're no longer the helper, the fixer, the peacekeeper, the placeholder. You're no longer the one who folds yourself into shapes just to fit someone else's emptiness. And when you stop playing those roles, something strange happens. People vanish, not all at once, but subtly, like a shift in season. Fewer texts, shorter conversations, missed calls that were never meant to be returned. You don't blame them at first. You blame yourself. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I've become cold. Maybe I expect too much. But deep down, something else begins to stir. A voice not heard in years, not since you were a child. A voice that doesn't ask for permission. A voice that doesn't beg to be liked. A voice that simply knows. And it whispers, you're remembering. Remembering who you were before you learned to hide, before you taught yourself to dim, before you convinced yourself that being accepted was more important than being real. And with that memory comes grief. You grieve the parts of yourself you silenced, the fire you smothered, the instincts you second-guessed because someone else called them too much. But as you grieve, you also begin to grow. You notice how much of your life was built around keeping others comfortable. You realize how often your silence was mistaken for agreement. You remember every time your honesty was called an attitude. Every time your standards were called difficult. Every time your clarity made others squirm. And you wonder, how much of my identity was just a mask to survive? You begin to feel the difference between loneliness and liberation. At first, they seem the same, both quiet, both cold, but one is heavy, and one is spacious. Loneliness says, you are alone because you're unworthy. Liberation says, you are alone because you've stopped performing. And Nietzsche knew this. He believed the beginning of true transformation is the loss of the crowd. That when a person begins to think independently, when they stop parroting the opinions handed down to them by culture, family, school, they will be cast out. Not in chains, but in silence. Not with violence, but with indifference. Because nothing terrifies the collective more than someone who no longer seeks its validation. If this is already stirring something inside you, don't just watch. Subscribe. Because this channel exists for the parts of you no one else speaks to. So if you've found yourself eating alone, walking alone, thinking alone, if you've noticed the absence more than the presence, if your conversations have gone from empty chatter to meaningful monologues with yourself, you're not dissolving, you're differentiating. And differentiation is the root of identity. This isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough. But here's the test. Can you sit in this in-between without turning back? Can you resist the urge to reach out to people who only loved the version of you that served them? Can you remain still while your former life decays and trust that something new will rise in its place? Because if you can, something rare begins to grow. Not louder thoughts, not more confidence, but deeper knowing. You start noticing how little others really hear, how often people talk to be admired, not to connect, how many friendships are built on proximity, not intimacy, how many relationships are just contracts of mutual convenience. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The invitation becomes clear: to stop seeking comfort in conformity and start finding strength in solitude. This is the threshold Nietzsche spoke of, the beginning of the free spirit, the precursor to the overperson, the raw, uncertain stage between the death of the mask and the birth of the self. But most people never cross it, because the cost feels too high. You will be misunderstood. You will be misnamed. You will be mythologized by people who never cared to know you. And you will have to be okay with that. You will have to stop chasing being seen and start learning to see yourself. And that, right there, is where the transformation truly begins. Because the moment you can hold your own gaze, the moment you can be with yourself in the silence, you no longer need others to confirm your worth. You become sovereign, not because you have more, but because you need less. And that kind of person, the one who needs less from the world, is the one who can finally give more to it. Drop a comment when something hits deep. You might help someone else who's still trapped in the part you've already healed. But first, you have to survive this silence. You have to learn to breathe in the space where applause used to live. You have to learn to stay when it's lonely, not because you're addicted to suffering, but because you finally understand the silence is not empty. It is full of your own voice, waiting to be heard. And now, we'll listen. Because once you hear yourself clearly, you'll understand why Nietzsche believed that losing the crowd was never the tragedy. It was always the beginning. There is a silence that doesn't echo, not because it's empty, but because it's full of something deeper than sound. You sit with it now, this heavy stillness that once felt unbearable. But you're learning it has a rhythm, a pulse, a language. This silence is not a void. It's a mirror, and it only reflects what you're ready to face. You're not who you were a year ago, and not just because of what you've lost, but because of what you've refused to keep carrying. You let go of people who only loved the echo of you. You stepped away from groups where truth had to be edited to be accepted. You walked away from places that fed your hunger for approval, but starved your spirit. And now, the silence sits with you. It's not chasing you. It's inviting you to sit still, to come closer, to look inward without flinching. This is the sacred threshold Nietzsche described, the place between everything you've outgrown and everything you've yet to become. It's not a destination. It's a crucible. Because When you begin to differentiate, when you stop being a reflection and start becoming a source, the world begins to resist. Not out of cruelty, but out of confusion. You used to be predictable. Your compliance made things easy. Your agreement made things smooth. Your silence kept others comfortable. But now, you ask questions that aren't polite. You say no without an apology. You choose solitude over small talk. And you're no longer entertaining the performance of closeness without the substance of intimacy. So people pull back. Not because you've become worse, but because you've become clear. And clarity is disruptive. It pierces through the fog that most people depend on to survive. It ruins the stories they tell themselves. It interrupts the games they've played for years. You used to be in those games too, laughing when it wasn't funny, agreeing just to avoid tension, smiling through discomfort because you were afraid of losing people. But you've already lost them. The moment you chose your truth over your image, they left. And what's left now is you. Just you. But don't mistake this moment as emptiness, because what feels like abandonment is often just realignment. The truth is, when you stop being who others expect, you begin to meet who you really are. And that's the person you've been avoiding all along. The one who remembers what freedom feels like. The one who doesn't settle for polite pain. The one who isn't afraid to walk alone, because they know who walks with them. The moment you stop chasing relationships out of fear, the dynamics shift. You begin to notice things you used to ignore. That some people only come close when they need something. That others applaud your growth until it no longer benefits them. That loyalty often means staying silent about what's wrong, just to keep the peace. But peace without truth isn't peace. It's performance. And your soul was never meant to perform. So now, when the calls stop, when the gatherings go quiet, when the people who used to orbit your light disappear, don't panic. Pause. Because what's falling away was never real. It was never rooted in your essence, only in your availability. And now that you're no longer available to be used, tolerated, or diluted, you're making space. Space for people who don't need you to shrink. People who don't flinch at your silence. People who sit in the stillness with you. Not to fix it, but to feel it with you. But before they come, there's this middle ground. And this is the part most people avoid. They run back to the crowd, not because it nourishes them, but because they fear being unseen. But you're still here. And that means something. It means you're willing to stay in the fear of this transformation, long enough to see what survives the burning. Nietzsche believed this was the gateway to becoming the overperson. Not someone superior, but someone sovereign. A person who no longer borrows meaning from society, because they've learned to generate it from within. A person who no longer follows the map, because they've become the compass. And that kind of person doesn't need a crowd to feel whole. They don't crave popularity. They crave alignment. They don't ask, do they like me? They ask, do I feel alive here? And if the answer is no, they leave. Not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. Because once you've tasted what it's like to honor yourself, you can't go back to begging others to do it for you. You realize that some doors don't need to be reopened. That closure isn't something others give you. It's something you give yourself. That healing isn't a performance you stage for others to applaud. It's a quiet revolution you undergo in the dark. And through it all, you become lighter. Not because the weight disappears, but because you stop carrying what was never yours. You stop arguing for your value. You stop explaining your needs. You stop proving your worth to people who were never listening. You stop giving your best to people who only ever noticed your absence. And instead, you return to yourself, not as the person they remember, but as the person you were always becoming. The person who no longer waits to be chosen, because they've already chosen themselves. If that makes you too much for some, let them go, because your too much will be someone else's just right. Your depth will be someone else's home. Your truth will be someone else's invitation to rise. But first, this waiting, this wondering, this holy disconnection. It's not punishment. It's preparation. Because when your silence is no longer scary, when your solitude no longer aches, when your presence is enough, even when no one else is around, that's when the real ones arrive. Not many, but enough. And not because you need them, but because you've become someone who no longer needs to pretend. Someone who walks into rooms with nothing to prove. Someone who knows when to speak and when to stay silent. Someone who can hold another person's truth because they've already made peace with their own. You're not losing friends. You're losing illusions. You're not becoming cold. You're becoming clear. You're not behind. You're becoming. And now, finally, we'll bring this full circle, because the silence that once felt like exile is actually the sound of you finally coming home. You reach a moment when everything you thought you needed falls silent, not with violence, but with clarity. The people you once tried so hard to keep. The roles you once played without question. The masks that once felt like skin. They all fall away. Not because you pushed them, but because you stopped holding on. There is no collapse, no public explosion, just a quiet decision. So subtle, you barely notice it at first. The decision to stop fighting for crumbs. The decision to stop mistaking tension for chemistry. The decision to stop abandoning your soul just to belong. And when that moment arrives, it changes everything. You wake up, and the ache isn't gone. But it's different. It's cleaner, sharper. No longer the dull, throbbing ache of pretending. It's the clarity pain of becoming. And it hurts. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're finally doing something real. Nietzsche spoke of this phase not as a reward, but as a responsibility. Because once you've seen through the noise, once the veil has lifted, you don't get to go back. Not without breaking something sacred inside you. You try. Maybe once. You reach back toward old friends, old patterns, old versions of yourself. You wonder if maybe you were too harsh, too quick to judge, too fast to let go. But when you return, it's different. The conversations feel thinner. The jokes fall flatter. The connection feels like static, not signal. And you realize you didn't outgrow the people. You outgrew the version of yourself that needed them. So you come back to the silence, this time willingly. You sit in it not as a prisoner, but as a practitioner. You learn its rhythms, its rituals. You learn that silence has memory. It remembers every part of you that you tried to silence. And now you begin the final descent, not into darkness, but into self. This is the part no one talks about, because it's not romantic. It's not inspiring. It's not made for social media quotes. It's raw. It's slow. It's spiritual. You start noticing how many of your choices were rooted in fear. How often your yes was actually a panic response. How many times you tried to heal others because you couldn't bear to sit with your own wounds. You grieve again. This time, not for what you've lost, but for the person you used to be, the one who gave so much, who waited, who tolerated, who never asked for more because they believed they were too much already. And as you grieve, you change. Not all at once, not in ways others can see, but quietly. You stop proving. You stop defending. You stop justifying your need for space, for depth, for truth. You just live it. You begin building rituals that no one sees. Morning silences, long walks, slow meals, time with yourself that feels like home. You stop seeking permission to exist in your fullness, and you start offering that permission to others, not through words, but through presence. You become the kind of person who doesn't try to fix people, who doesn't chase closure, who doesn't need every conversation to end with agreement. You stop performing love. You start embodying it. And now, people begin to return. But not the ones you lost. New ones. Different ones. They move slower. They speak with more intention. They don't need access to every part of you. They're just grateful to be near your energy. You don't impress them. You resonate with them. They don't seek your approval. They respect your boundaries. Because like you, they've been through the silence too. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said, "Become who you are, not who you were told to be, not who you had to become to survive, but the person you've always been beneath the noise. And that person isn't lonely. They are whole. Loneliness was just the smoke signal of self-abandonment. Now that you've come home to yourself, you see it differently. You no longer fear being alone because you no longer feel alone in your own presence. You don't need others to echo your worth. You are the voice now. You are the ground. You are the mirror. And yes, people will misunderstand this. They'll think you're distant, aloof, unreachable. But that's because they've only ever known connection through chaos. They don't recognize peace as love. They only recognize urgency. Let them learn. You don't have to teach them. You don't have to explain. You just have to keep walking, quietly, consistently, deeply, because the way you live will become the lesson. And one day, maybe years from now, someone will sit across from you and say, "Being around you makes me feel like I can be myself." And you'll smile, because you'll know. That's how it starts. That's how the light spreads. Not through noise, but through presence. Not through preaching, but through becoming. So if you have no friends right now, if the silence is still thick, if you wonder whether this path leads anywhere at all, Know this: you are not behind. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are becoming. And becoming is a lonely process, not because you are meant to be alone, but because not everyone is meant to come with you. This is your rite of passage, your sacred unraveling, your cosmic reset. You're not empty. You're being cleared. You're not rejected. You're being rerouted. You're not unlovable. You're learning to love without losing yourself. So, rest now. Let the silence hold you. Let the loneliness teach you. Let the grief pass through you. Because on the other side of this quiet is the version of you you've always been meant to meet. And they will never abandon you, because they've walked through every storm with you. They've waited beneath every mask. They've whispered in every moment you tried to leave yourself. And now, you've finally heard them. You've returned. You are not alone anymore.